Hey, beautiful girl, sing. Hey, baby, hey.
The first slaves in the United States arrived in 1619. However, it was not until the 19th century that a concerted abolitionist movement began. This movement had both white and black supporters. However, their thoughts on how many rights a black man should have were different. Most slaves were held by the Underground Railroad and its conductors. One of the most notable of these conductors was Harriet Tubman. After escaping from slavery, she first fled to Philadelphia, then returned to Maryland to free her family and others. Having successfully saved her family, she continued her work through the Underground Railroad, which resulted in the liberation of over 70 slaves. The Underground Railroad was a network of safe houses that allowed Tubman and other escaped slaves to find their way north. The South put out a bounty for Harriet Tubman worth $40,000, or around $1 million present day, dead or alive. She was the first woman to lead an armed expedition in the war as she guided the Combahee River Raid. It liberated more than 700 slaves in South Carolina. Later in her life, Harriet Tubman became active in the women's suffrage movement in New York until she fell ill. Near the end of her life, she moved into a home for elderly African Americans that she helped found years earlier.
Not every abolitionist guided slaves to freedom. Another prominent black abolitionist was Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was born a slave but managed to escape to the city of Rochester, New York to begin his notable career as a statesman and an orator against slavery. Douglass had endured many hardships under the yoke of slavery. However, the hardships Douglass suffered helped fuel the fire for abolitionism when he wrote about his trials in the memoir, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. He wrote several autobiographies to describe his experiences of slavery to support abolition. This autobiography immediately became a bestseller and was quickly translated into French and Dutch for the circulation in Europe. Frederick Douglass was a living entity of the hopes of the African Americans. He was the first African American to become nominated to be the vice president. Frederick Douglass traveled to Ireland shortly after his escape in case his ex-owner decided to try to recapture him. He commented on his experiences there and how he was treated equally among the white people, and he also became friends with Irish nationalist Daniel O'Connell. After returning to the U.S., he began to write white abolitionist papers, including the North Star, Frederick Douglass Weekly, Douglass Monthly, and a few others. In 1848, Douglass attended the Seneca Falls Convention and was the first and only African-American male there. He presented and gave a speech saying he could not accept the right to vote as a black man if women could not also. After Lincoln's death, Frederick Douglass became the keynote speaker at his funeral.
Born Isabella Baumfree, Sojourner Truth grew up in slavery and became an important black abolitionist and women's rights activist. Her services were bought by Isaac von Wagner until the New York State Emancipation Act was approved a year later. After gaining legal freedom, one of Truth's sons was illegally sold by John Dumont. With the help of the Wagners, Truth went to court against John Dumont and became one of the first black women to go to court against a white man and win. In May of 1851, Truth attended the Women's Rights Convention in Akron, Ohio. She delivered a simple but powerful speech which was recorded in the June 21, 1851 issue of the Anti-Slavery Bugle. It is this speech which was transformed into the Ain't I a Woman legend by Frances Donna Gage that gained Truth national recognition. Truth's speech was published complete with crude Southern dialect in the New York Independent, a popular newspaper at the time. This speech, which was said to have been the most powerful speech at the convention, was the first major accomplishment of Truth's career for equal rights.
Black and white abolitionists hated slavery and fought hard for emancipation. However, the struggle was much more personal for black abolitionists, because not only were they fighting for freedom, but also for equal rights. Many white abolitionists, although they decried slavery, could not see blacks as their equals. Dred Scott was an African-American slave in the United States who unsuccessfully sued for his freedom and that of his wife and their 2 daughters in the Dred Scott v. Stanford case of 1857, popularly known as the Dred Scott decision. His case was based on the fact that although he and his wife Harriet Scott were slaves, he had lived with his master Dr. John Emerson in states and territories where slavery was illegal, according to both state law and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The United States Supreme Court decided 7-2 against Scott, finding that neither he nor any other person of African ancestry could claim citizenship in the United States, and therefore Scott could not bring suit in federal courts under diversity of citizenships rules. Moreover, Scott's temporary residence outside Missouri did not bring about his emancipation under the Missouri Compromise, which the court ruled unconstitutional as it would improperly deprive Scott's owner of his legal property. The Dred Scott case ended the prohibition of slavery in federal territories and prohibited Congress from regulating slavery anywhere. However, the ruling of the court helped create sentiment for Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and the 3 constitutional amendments ratified shortly after the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, abolishing slavery, granting former slaves citizenship, and conferring citizenship to anyone born in the United States.
As the movement progressed, many whites felt as though things would get out of hand if blacks gained their freedom. They feared that the blacks would flood the North, causing competition for jobs and other opportunities. The whites involved agreed that if slavery was not made a public issue, then nothing would be done about it. Seeing this, the black abolitionists realized that more was needed to reach their goals, even if this meant resistance or violence. Abraham Lincoln's views on slavery were formed by the times and places in which he was raised and during which he served his country. Slavery was a recognized institution in the United States throughout Lincoln's formative years. Lincoln's personal feelings about blacks and about slavery actually were quite constant over time. His political position and actions regarding slavery changed as the national political situation changed. Lincoln initially recognized that slavery was a bad institution, but one that was accepted and necessary for the South's economy. In Bloomington, Illinois, he stated that Southern slaveholders were neither better nor worse than we of the North, and that we of the North were no better than they. And we never ought to lose sight of this fact in discussing the subject. Additionally, he appeared to support the belief that blacks did not deserve equal treatment of whites. This view probably resulted from the family background in which he was raised and educated. Abraham Lincoln was born in a slave state, but his father and most of the other small farmers in that part of Kentucky did not own slaves. Lincoln's homes after 1830, Indiana and Illinois, were free states, but both states were very unfavorable towards blacks and severely limited the rights of free blacks. Black abolitionism took many forms. Some, like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth, wrote books and gave lectures about their experiences. They tried to persuade others to join them in the fight against discrimination, or at least share their opinions. Other abolitionists, such as Harriet Tubman, took more physical actions by leading slaves north on the Underground Railroad. This approach was very different from white abolitionism because blacks wanted freedom and equality, while whites still believed blacks to be inferior and only deserved freedom, not full citizenship. Although the abolitionist movement lost momentum after the Dred Scott case, the results increased abolitionist fervor and garnered support for the passing of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and the emancipation of all slaves.
Jubilee in the evening.